Hey everybody, it's Jason from the Texas Gun Vault, and today I want to come to you with a video about hammer pins and trigger pins, and more specifically, Mil-Spec versus anti-walk and anti-rotation pins. In my time making YouTube videos, there are a few topics that I have discovered when it comes to people of the gun. They lie on one side of the fence, they will not budge, and for some reason they debate with a lot of ferocity and passion. And one of those is pins for AR-15s, and I am very perplexed by that. So before we start this conversation, I think it is important that we talk about how these pins work in an AR-15, and more specifically a standard Mil-Spec pin, and how Eugene Stoner initially designed them. As you can see in this pin, we have two grooves. Now it does not matter which way you insert these pins through the receiver for either the trigger or the hammer, because both pins are the same, and these grooves serve a very specific purpose. They're the places that lock the pin into place, whether it is in the trigger or in the hammer. Let's take a look here at a standard AR-15 style hammer, and I do have the hammer spring on this. What holds this pin in place when it is in the receiver is something called a J-spring. Now if you look at the bottom of this hammer, you might see something silver right in the center of that, and there's a spring that is bent and goes up through it, and you can see part of it right there in that little witness hole, and through the part where the pin is going to go through. That J-spring puts tension on the pin, and it goes into that center groove. And so when the pin is inserted all the way through, it locks it in, and essentially the pin itself rotates with the hammer because it is holding steady with that spring. Now when it is in the trigger, you will notice that there is a groove on the outside, and the spring on the hammer, when it is inserted into the receiver, rests on top of the trigger, and when the pin is through it, it locks into that groove on the side, therefore preventing the pins from walking out and keeping them in place. What many people think is the downside to these types of pins is the fact, especially when it comes to the pin that goes through the hammer, because it rotates in the receiver, it can wear out the aluminum receiver because these pins are made of steel. Now many people will point out that Eugene Stoner did not overlook this and designed it specifically this way. But I have a couple of arguments that I want to talk about and also debunk a couple of myths. The first thing is that when Eugene Stoner designed this rifle and these pins to be used in the AR-15 and the M16, he was designing a rifle that was going to be used essentially for the military. Now when it comes to the military, they don't really have to worry about guns wearing out, especially in the long term, because they can just replace them. They'll never have a time where due to laws, they will be barred from buying assault weapons. Plus, they have an unlimited amount of funds. Now, when it comes to these pins, do they really wear out AR-15 and M16 receivers? Well, the answer is debatable. A lot of people say after hundreds of thousands of rounds through some receivers, you can start to get the holes egged out a little bit. And of course, if there are other problems with the trigger or the hammer or the internals of the gun, it can exacerbate that wear, because this pin rotating in that hole after all of those rounds will make that hole wider, and therefore the tolerances in the gun wrong, and that can cause malfunctions. However, I should say that for the most part, for the casual shooter, you will never wear out an AR-15 lower receiver. Unless you're putting hundreds of thousands of rounds through it, the stock pins will always work just fine. You'll never really have to replace them, and you'll never have any problems with the receiver. However, some people might be a little bit more OCD and approach this problem in a different way. So for example, when it comes to me and my personal collecting, I don't think about the these guns as just being mine, I sure hope that they outlast me, that they go to my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. And so I want these receivers to last, especially because in the future we may have laws that bar civilian ownership or transfer of these. And you want these to last for as long as possible. So coming up with a solution possibly to have a pin which does not rotate and wear out the receiver might be advantageous to some if that's something that you care about. Now, I should say that Eugene Stoner was a genius, and he designed this intentionally the way it is. And for all purposes of the military and of law enforcement, you will not have a problem with this whatsoever. But I do want to argue to the people that say, well, Eugene Stoner had it right, you don't want to mess with it. Well, let's take a look at a rifle like this. I have a Geisley handguard on it. We got all these modern optics and rails. We have adjustable stocks. We have a lot of modern parts on this that Eugene Stoner, when he designed the original M16, could never have imagined. But people would say all of these are worthwhile upgrades. They really enhance the performance of this rifle. So why, when it comes to the pins, does everybody want to stay back in the Stone Age of the AR-15? Not that there's anything wrong with that. It just seems weird that the people that are very passionate against anti-rotation pins or anti-walk pins will always cite that the gun was designed to have these in the first place, so you don't want to change them. Well, if that's the case, why aren't you all shooting Colt 601 clones? Because that's the way they were originally designed. But now that we've talked about mil-spec pins and standard pins and how they work and operate and maybe the downside to them in a long-term scenario, let's talk about a couple of options that companies have come out with to find a solution to this problem. I want to start first with the anti-walk pins. Now, these are pins that are essentially designed to prevent the pin from coming out of the receiver during operation. There are some times when these pins, I have heard, will come out of the gun, and that of course can cause a catastrophic failure and of course the gun to stop working in the field. And so what some companies have done have created pins like this. So what we have is a pin that goes through the trigger and the hammer, and they have these little screw heads on them on both sides, and when those are tightened down, that will prevent the heads and the pin themselves from coming out of the receiver. Now, I want to say that when it comes to these style of pins, I find them to be very unnecessary with the exception of one application. The reason being is if your concern is the pins walking out of the firearm, well, because these pins are designed to go into the grooves with the springs, both with the hammer in the center and on the trigger on the side of these pins, if your pins are walking out of your firearm, well, there's a problem internally, and you need to check either the J-spring on the hammer down here and through the hole, or you need to check the hammer spring itself to make sure that they are not broke. As long as those things are fine, your pins should never walk out of your gun. So I actually think the anti-walk pins are actually unnecessary with the exception of one application. And that application would be if you have a drop-in trigger that is one contained unit. So sometimes you'll notice this with Timony triggers. They drop into the receiver, and often those will not have a J-spring or any type of retention for the springs, and having an anti-walk pin I actually find works really well on those self-contained units. But when it comes to a standard trigger, I don't really recommend them, and I don't use them personally. The only reason I'm using this gun here as an example is that this JP Enterprises gun is into the channel on loan for review, and so it does have these anti-walk pins, so I wanted to show you what those look like and talk about the application that I think they should be used for. But now let's talk about the type of pins that I use on many of my builds, and these are going to be the anti-rotation pins. And often you're going to see them made by a company called K&S Precision. And these kits are designed to prevent the pins from rotating when the gun is in operation. And the concept is to prevent them from wearing out the receiver over time. And I find that when it comes to guns that are very valuable or I think are very expensive, for example, this is a Barrett Rec 7 lower receiver on one of my SBRs, so therefore I do want to take care of this receiver. So I have added it to this build. I have never had a problem with these at all. Now there are a few myths about this that people always cite, and they'll always say, hey, I read this on Reddit, or I talked to a gunsmith and they said this about these anti-rotation pins and how they're garbage and they're trash. But I wanted to discuss a couple of those because I think I can debunk one of the big ones right now. One of those big myths that I always read online is that when people tighten down these screws to prevent them from rotating because there's an arm that attaches to both and it stabilizes them, is that these pins will begin to compress the receiver. Now I have to tell you, if you have the strength through a little tiny screw to compress this aluminum receiver, well, you are a lot stronger than I am. However, I do want to point out that I believe this is a myth and people are just making this up because these pins are actually longer than the receiver is wide, and I can even prove it. I will grab a piece of paper right here, and if this non-rotating pin set was attached to this gun so tightly that it bent the receiver in and causing problems, then how in the world can I put a piece of paper through it? Yeah, it's not compressing that at all. All this bar does right here is prevent the pins from rotating because it's attached on both pins, thus creating one unit. However, because the pins are thicker than the receiver themselves, that bar isn't really touching the receiver itself and therefore not compressing the receiver at all. I've read this, and many people that will cite this problem are people that have never used these pins. Maybe one of their gun tube heroes had mentioned it in the past, or they read a Reddit post where somebody said that was a problem. Well, I have never experienced that, and I have installed these pins on many guns, and all of them have had that gap in there, and I believe that gap is there on purpose. It prevents the compression of the receiver. But even if it was flush with the receiver, trust me, those pins are not short enough where you could compress it, and to compress that aluminum wall of the receiver would take a lot of strength. I just don't think you're going to have any issues with that whatsoever. The other problem that people will cite is that because this pin does not rotate with the hammer, that J-spring of the hammer will wear on that pin and therefore cause it to prematurely break. Now, as I said, I have these pins in many of my receivers and I have never had one break. However, there is a way to hopefully prevent this or to check for this. And this is something I think you should do after every single range visit. When you bring your rifle home to clean, it is always important to maintain it by checking its function. So I'll just go ahead and pull out the pin here in the back, and I'll just open up this receiver, and I will always check the hammer, and I will make sure that it works. This is just a basic function check. This is just to make sure that the gun is in good operational condition. And this is something you should do even if you're not going to clean the gun. Just like an airline pilot will make sure that his plane is mechanically sound before every flight, even if the plane just landed about an hour ago, he'll go over and double check everything. I think as a firearms owner, you should do exactly the same thing. And I think if you just put a little bit of oil on that hammer spring and you check it after every range visit, you will not have that pin break. And often people will say, well, if the pin breaks, you're going to start having failures. Well, if you start having failures, you need to take your gun apart and check and see what's going on. And I should say that I have heard stories of people's regular Mil-Spec pins breaking as well. So it's just basic maintenance. It's good to have extra pins on hand. And if your gun begins to malfunction and your hammer is wobbly, you have problems with cycling, well, that's just basic maintenance of your gun. You can't expect these things to last forever. Now, there is one application where I do recommend that if you are going to run the Mil-Spec pins that you go in a different direction than the standard pen that I just showed you and go with a stainless steel pen. Let me bring out another gun here that I want to show you. This is another one of my SBRs. This is my Colt AR-15 9mm carbine, which of course now is also in SBR, and you will notice that the pins of this gun, which look Mil-Spec, but are stainless steel. Yeah, you will find that Colt puts these pins on all of their 9mm carbines for a very specific reason. And that reason is the action of a 9mm AR-15 actually moves a lot faster than a standard 5.56, and it puts a lot more pressure on these pins, and more specifically, the hammer pin. Because the action moves so fast, they were discovering that these standard pins were actually breaking prematurely, causing that problem that I was talking about just a moment ago. But in order for them to slow the action down and to prevent these pins from breaking, what they were doing is they were eliminating the ramp on the 9mm bolts. And let me see if I can take this out and show it to you here. Now this one does have the ramp, and I'll show it to you. So on the bottom here, you can see there is a sloped portion of this bolt. Now this is a modern bolt, and most 9mm carbines will have them, but for a long time they did not have this ramp. The idea was to lower the point of impact on the hammer, which would slow the action of the gun down. But that caused more pressure on that pin because the bolt was coming back down at a lower angle. And so what they did to fix this problem is they replaced the standard pins with ones that were made of stainless steel, which is a harder material. Now, I do recommend that if you are going to make or build or own a 9mm AR-15, that you do use the non-rotating pin sets. I believe those are just going to be a little bit better and save your receiver, because Colt was having a lot of problems with these pins egging out this receiver because of that bolt not being ramped and the speed of the action. But once they ramped the bolt and they put in stainless steel pins, they ran a lot more reliably. And it should be noted that these stainless steel pins run and work just like the standard pins. They're just made of a different material. So if you have a Colt 9mm AR-15, make sure that you do have the stainless steel pins in there. And if your bolt is not ramped, if you have an older one, you can send it off to some gunsmiths to have them add that ramp, or you can buy a more modern bolt that will work. But if you do have a ramped bolt, make sure to have either the stainless steel pins or the non-rotating pins, because that's going to save your receiver over time. In 9mm AR-15s, those pins take a lot of pressure when it comes to that bolt and the action of the gun as compared to one in 5.56. So in my opinion, people are going to ask, what type of pin should I have in my gun? Well, if you don't care about the longevity of the gun, well, the Mil-Spec standard pins are going to work just fine. You will never have a problem with them. They probably should not break, and if you have all proper springs in your gun and the gun is put together correctly, you will not have them walk out. Honestly, Eugene Stoner had it right from the beginning. However, if you do want to build an enhanced AR-15, I would recommend going with the anti-rotation pins. These will save the receivers. As I said, if you're thinking about the longevity of your gun for generations to come, that would prevent any problems with egging out those holes, thus making the receiver inoperable and not suitable for standard use in the future. Now, sometimes people will say there are guns that have hundreds of thousands of rounds through them and those holes have not egged out. Well, there is a reason why. You can go online and buy pins that are oversized, because as those pin holes wear out, you might have to go to a size that is a little bit bigger. I want to say this pin is 0.154 inches in diameter, and they do make 0.155 diameter pins and ones that are even larger to try to make them work in receivers that have the holes that have been egged out and enlarged because they have such a high round count. And then of course, going back to the anti-walk pins, I don't really recommend these unless you have a trigger pack that is one part and it's all encapsulated into one unit. this would prevent them from walking, because that's really the only time you're going to have pins that are going to walk, because they might not be retained by internal springs. But I do use and recommend the anti-rotational pins. Those are the ones that I've always worked with, I've always liked, I've never had a problem with them, and despite what people will tell you, they do not compress the receiver. As you can see, I could not put that paper between that if it was compressing that receiver. So I hope this video answered some questions. I know there's going to be some people in the comments section that will say, all of this is wrong, you need to have these pins, Geisley recommends them, it's the way Eugene Stoner designed them. Well, as I said, if that's the case, you need to go get yourself a Colt 601 and only shoot that, because that's the way Eugene Stoner originally designed them. Don't have any free float handguards, don't upgrade your rifles in any way. So there you go. That's my thoughts on standard pins, non-rotational pin sets, anti-walk pin sets, and I guess we'll say stainless steel pin custom sets for Colt 9mm AR-15s. So I hope this video helps somebody in the future and answers some questions. So, as always, thanks for watching.